Welcome to Technovation. I'm your host, Peter High. My guest today is Rich Karlgaard. Rich is the publisher emeritus of Forbes, a periodical that he's contributed to for more than 2 decades. He's the best-selling author of books like Late Bloomers, The Soft Edge, and Life 2.0. He speaks at conferences around the world and has one of the best networks of anyone in business. He's also my partner on the Forbes CIO Summit series. Our next conference is on October 27th in New York. If you're a CIO, we hope you can join us. Rich is a font of knowledge on numerous topics relevant to our audience, and I look forward to mining many of them with him today. Rich, welcome back to Technovation. It's always great to speak with you.
It's great to see you, Peter, and I can't wait for 8 days from this recording, October 27th, when you and I will be hosting the Forbes CIO Next Conference in New York.
That's going to be so great. Going to be great to see you. Going to be great to see the wonderful group of CIOs that we've assembled for that, and the great content as well. It'll be a great pleasure. Well, speaking of conferences, Rich, you are recently back from the Forbes Global Chief Executive Officer Conference in Singapore. And I know from a couple of catch-ups you and I've had since, a lot of interesting things covered. I mean, what an interesting time to gather global chief executive officers to understand what's on their radar, what they're worried about or excited about. I wonder if you could provide just a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of some of the interesting insights you garnered from that your time at the conference.
Well, sure. All hats off to the Forbes Asia team for putting on a conference. This is the 20th Forbes Global CEO Conference. We started it in 2001, but obviously we missed 2 years because of the pandemic. So it was great to be back in a world where we're transcending virtual fist bumps and actually shaking hands and getting a read of the room and how people are really thinking about this, frankly, terribly scary economy right now. We had really powerful people in the room. We had over $500 billion of personal wealth in the room, 450 attendees, and they ranged from entrepreneurs to, particularly in Asia and Southeast Asia, there are a lot of conglomerate family-owned kinds of businesses where a business might be in the hospitality industry and the aluminum extraction industry at the same time. So a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of family businesses, a lot of important people from government, from India, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and so on. And the world is at a crossroads. Let's just not mince words here. And I think the feeling in the room is that one path really leads to greater innovation, more prosperity, solving a lot of the world's big problems in the near term to the longer term challenges like climate change. And how do we thread the needle where we have more energy, more affordable energy, more secure energy, while at the same time we're not heating up the planet. And that's a great discussion, a lot of interesting talk there, but we have the near-term challenges as well. From an Asian perspective, the biggest near-term challenge is the worsening relationship between China and the US. If you're Southeast Asia, now, this is a Singapore conference, so it was sort of more tilted towards Southeast Asian CEOs, although there were CEOs from the United States, from Europe, and Northern Asian countries like Japan and Korea and so on, and India. In fact, we had the world's second richest man, Gautam Adani, spoke on day 2 at the conference, and he's very bullish on India. But the near term, if you're the Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN, Singapore is the financial hub of ASEAN. You have Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, other countries. They add up to about twice the population of the EU. And they're highly dependent on trade. So when the two big economic players on the planet, the US and China, there's worsening relationships, this scares people in Southeast Asia because they want to be friends with both. They don't want to have to be forced to pick sides. They love the United States. They have accommodated themselves to China, even if there's not a lot of love there, and there's less love than there was 5 years ago. But there was fear in the air, and what I heard was the word resilience was said multiple times and inferred many more. That if you're a business leader in the world today, no matter where you're from, but particularly from Southeast Asia, you're going to really focus on resilience more than you are top-line growth. for the next 2 or 3 years. Short-term challenges of inflation and what are central banks going to do, and supply chains that are still not fully functioning. What are you going to do? Now, an example of resilience where you're going to pay more for it, but people are willing to pay more for it, is multiple supply chains. The world spent 30 years perfecting one giant, hugely efficient supply chain with China at the hub. And that is no longer working. Nobody wants to put all their chips on China today, including countries that are friends with China. Look at what Apple did by moving a bunch of manufacturing capability from China to Vietnam. So when you have multiple supply chains, you pay for them. It costs to have backup systems. So that's an example where people, I think, are willing to pay for resilience at the expense of top line growth. But at the end of the day, my God, what an opportunity for IT and CIOs. I mean, if we're going to have multiple supply chains, then using predictive analytics to know when to flip the switch from one supply chain to another, I think this is just going to be a huge opportunity for enterprise software and for far-minded CIOs.
Yeah, really great insights across the board. Another sort of general question about your time at the conference in Singapore, Rich. It's always useful for us as Americans to get some distance from our home country, and especially with people of influence and insight, to understand kind of their impressions of the US. And I wonder, no doubt you were in conversations with people presenting their own thoughts, whether optimistic or otherwise, about where the US is headed. Any kind of top line thoughts there in terms of what you were hearing?
Well, to put it mildly, the executives of Southeast Asia and the government officials are really worried about the unforced errors that are happening both in the United States and in China. Now, after China's 20th Party Congress last week, as we record this, so in the middle of October, that where everybody was hoping for President Xi to signal more economic reform and openness, and he did quite the opposite. That's an example of an unforced error. Zero COVID policy is an example of an unforced error. And in the United States, the examples of the unforced errors are, first of all, creating the groundwork for inflation by the $2 trillion post-COVID economic relief package, all the bickering that goes on in the United States between the two parties, the seeming inability of the United States to look beyond 6 months. As I was fortunate to be able to interview on stage a gentleman named Lawrence Wong. Lawrence Wong is the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. He's the Minister of Finance also. And he's widely believed to be the next Prime Minister of Singapore, probably in around 2025. In fact, I asked him, and he said he would let us know, but he said it with a wink and a smile. So the current Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, is really, got his eye on this Deputy Prime Minister Wong. And he described the U.S., he says, it's democracy, it's rambunctious, and he smiled. And I think everybody wishes both China and the U.S. would stop making these unforced errors. But I think, on balance, and I say this with an American bias, I think particularly given what's happened in China over the last 2 or 3 years and the turn inward, I think that people, for all of the flaws in the United States, people still look to us as a beacon. Europe is in a deep recession, headed for a possible depression this winter. You talk about unforced errors, Germany walking away from nuclear power. I mean, how foolish was that? Smart for France not to do it. But Europe is just the bastion of unforced errors on economic policy, and they're going to pay for it mightily this winter, and we'll see for how long.
Do you have a sense, Rich, as to how much the U.S. is going to be able to sort of resolve these issues independent of the crises that are happening in so many different places? I mean, obviously, this is a very connected world. And so as much as multinationals in the U.S. and the intertwined economies, our own, with so many other countries where those other countries have issues, there are going to be downstream ramifications to us. But there are also some pontificators that are suggesting that we may catch a cold, whereas others will have the flu, so to say. I don't know if you have gained any interesting insights, or just from your your own thinking, your own wanderings, and having dynamic conversations with people who are quite knowledgeable on this. If you have any thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, I think the big debate right now is in the United States, and one the whole world is paying attention to, is what our Federal Reserve is going to do. Now, inflation hawks will tell you that the Fed simply has to put its foot down in the way that Paul Volcker put his foot down in the late 1970s and early 80s. Paul Volcker was the Fed chairman appointed by Jimmy Carter, but he, in the very late Carter administration and the early Reagan administration, just kept hiking interest rates until we had a mild recession in 1980, and then we had a really ugly recession in 1982, but it was blessedly short, a matter of small months. And then the fever broke and inflation broke, and the 80s and 90s became pretty good economic decades. Forgotten in that narrative, though, was that inflation just isn't about monetary policy. I mean, it's also about supply and demand. And right now, there is a lot of demand in the world, which means the latent condition of the global economy is actually pretty good right now, if we don't kill it. There's a lot of demand out there. There's just supply shortages here and there and everywhere. And that's what's leading to price inflation. Price inflation is not the same as monetary inflation. I think we do ourselves a disservice to kind of consider them both as inflation. And so the debate is whether the US Federal Reserve should be trying to solve a supply price inflation in addition to the monetary inflation. There's a lot of evidence that the Fed has already done its work. The dollar is very strong. How many times have we seen a really strong dollar when we have monetary inflation? Not a lot. The other thing is that the producer inflation. We see the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. The producer inflation actually peaked in May at around 12 to 15% in April and May, and now is running at about 5 to 6%. If you believe that producer inflation is a leading indicator of where consumer inflation is going to go, then the Fed has already done its work. And maybe, we're for sure going to get a 0.75 rate hike in the next few days, probably early November after the election. So the Fed does not seem to be interfering in the midterm election. So probably November 10th, the day after the election, we'll see another 0.75. That'll take us to, 4 4.25, something like that. Probably get one more in the spring. I hope that they pause after that. I hope they pause. I'm more of the view that the Fed should not be trying to solve a supply price inflation with monetary tools. If we have one more 0.75 in the first quarter of 2023, then we'll have 5% Fed funds rate. We can live with that. A lot of the 80s and 90s, is that or even more. So I think that what allocators of capital, both in the investment world and in the corporate world, should we invest in a big AI overhaul inside of organization? They're looking for clarity. Even if the clarity is not exactly what they wanted, interest rates end up being higher than they wanted. At least if they have clarity, they can start allocating capital. So that all makes me fairly bullish. More bullish than most, I think, about 2023. Add one more factor, and that's that I think that I will bet any viewer of yours $100 that a year from now the stock market will be 20% higher than it is on the day that this publishes this interview. There's historical precedence for that. Since 1930, the third year of a president's term, even if a president has 2 terms, the third year of term 1 and term 2, in this case, it'll be Biden's third year of his first term, the stock market averages about a 16% gain. In the other 3 years, it's 6 to 7%. So we get our 8 to 9% by adding all that up. But the outlier is year 3. And I think there's a lot of psychology going on in the economy right now, where where we may be in danger of talking ourselves into a deeper recession than we're going to experience. And so I think the stock market is, if it does go up, this historically is suggested, then I think that will have a positive influence on people's mood.
I love that. I love that we'll have a chance to test that data and see if anyone takes you up on that bet. It's so curious. I'd never heard that statistic before, that data before. What's part of the logic of the third? What's so important? You're getting past the midterms, of course, which traditionally are very poor for the incumbent, especially in their first term. What else beyond that is sort of a catalyst for increased growth in the stock market?
Yeah, any decent economist would say this is a correlation, not causation.
Yeah.
The pool is way too small and it's all a bunch of horse pucky. But if you accept that there's some historical truth here, it probably does relate to the midterms.
Yes.
And it's simply that investors see clarity about the second half of the current administration, what can be done, what can't be done. Markets famously like mixed governments, so generally a midterm election brings you closer to a mixed government, so not all one party gets everything. And so that's sort of the general logic behind it, although an economist would tell you to ignore it. But we're not, economists are totally rational and human beings are not totally rational.
Well said. Very well said, Rich. Well, I want to return to a topic we've already raised in brief and go into it in a little bit more depth and breadth for that matter. You talked about the role that CIOs are going to play in what you have described. And, I find it to be, this is a conversation you and I have had off the record so many times about the remarkable growth of the role, a role that not so long ago was almost definitively a support organization within most enterprises, that in recent years has become among the most strategic, and especially, if anything, amplified much more significantly through the course of the pandemic. And so CIOs do have a role to play in what you have diagnosed as the current issues and the potential future issues, as well as the pathway back towards kind of righting the economy, righting individual companies along the way as well. I would actually maybe take a quick step back before we pontificate about the roles that CIOs would play. Talk about a bit about your own relationship with enterprise technology and your interest in it. You and I've talked about it at some length before, but I find it very interesting, how you have developed your own kind of passion and interest and curiosity around enterprise technology.
Well, first, it must be said that most of what I know about CIOs and high-performing CIOs I've learned from you, from your practice at Meta Strategy, from your superb videos, the Technovation videos. I hope this one doesn't ruin your hot streak and cause your people to complain about your quality control. But I remember very early, after getting to know you maybe 10 years ago and inviting you to participate and then lead the Forbes CIO conferences, that how you delineated the world between CIOs and CIO pluses, the latter being the ones who are in the big bucks, who have the real C-suite peer status with all the other C-suite peers, who have the ear of the CEO, if not reporting to the CEO directly, who have FaceTime with the board of directors, if not being on the board of directors, and so they truly are great leaders for the time that we live in. My interest in enterprise technology, I have this theory that you get consumer technology when you're young, because you're playing with it all the time. So young people understand TikTok. It was young people who understood Instagram. Young people were the first to really embrace the iPhone. They were first to embrace iPhone apps. It's just the nature of things that when you're young, you're actually playing with technology and you understand it better. Enterprise technology, I think, is better understood by more veterans in their career, sort of maybe mid-career and later career, because enterprise technology is really, I kind of think of it, it has elements of consumer technology. It certainly obeys Moore's law, and all the things, the drivers that drive consumer technology also apply to enterprise technology. But it's consultative, and anything that's consultative, begins to look more, it looks like McKinsey or your company, Meta Strategy. People are making huge purchases. now and then there are developments in enterprise technology where that sort of maybe drive it more toward the consumer end. Certainly great leaps in user interfaces or maybe pricing models. Even now, after 20 years of subscription, replacing buying software for a contracted period of time, now it's being replaced yet again by hours and minutes of usage time. We'll see how that plays out. But anyway, I think that I just watched my own evolution. I remember this is an example how you understand technology when you're young in a way that maybe you're slower to understand when you're older, but then you understand organizational dynamics and things like that better when you're older. But I remember really dating myself here, but I remember the first time I saw the Apple Macintosh, and it was in a Macy's store in 1985, and it was the day after the 1980 or in 84. It was the day after the 1984 Super Bowl, in which Apple ran its famous, 1984 won't be 1984, and it was a subtle dig, not so subtle dig against IBM. And I just was really curious about this thing called the Macintosh. I'd read about the Lisa, and I was a reader of computer magazines at the time, but now I had a chance to go look at one. What instantly struck me was that you could change type fonts on the screen, and there were maybe only 6 or 8 type fonts, but wow. Now, this came at a time when there were only dot matrix printers. Laser printers had yet to be, make it into the marketplace. That would take about a year for that to happen. When the Mac had no hard drive, when there were very just rudimentary word processing programs, let alone some of the first page layout programs like PageMaker and then later Quark Express. But somehow I had that insight that this would become a platform of publishing that would be completely different and allow people to get into publishing magazines, things like that, at a much lower point of entry. Now, of course, the same thing happened in the late 90s with the web. But I didn't see it as quickly as people who were younger than me at that time. And I wish I had, because the ecosystem of the web paid a lot more than the ecosystem of desktop publishing. But the desktop publishing allowed a friend of mine and I to start what became Silicon Valley's first business magazine, Upside, in 1989. We did a cover story on Kleiner Perkins, that Kleiner Perkins, the fabled venture capital firm, did not like, because we said KP3, their third fund, was going to be below market returns. And indeed, that was the case. And but we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have the platform of desktop publishing to create a magazine on the cheap. So that allowed me not to have to go through, in terms of my career at Forbes and so on, in magazines, it allowed me to leapfrog to being a head editor right from the go, because I was the founding editor and art director of Upside. And Steve Forbes tried to buy Upside, and then he ended up hiring me instead. And right from the get-go, in my beginning of my career, I reported to Steve Forbes with the agenda of starting a magazine called Forbes ASAP. So yeah, journalism as a career path can really eat you up, is what I've observed, because there are so many steps along the ladder toward becoming the head of sales or the head editor or whatever it is, that constantly, and the money is not good until the top rung, that a lot of people peel off and into PR and corporate communications and things like that, and then a lot of journalists simply become cynical over time. It's an occupational hazard of journalism that your skepticism leaches into cynicism, because you've been told so many tall tales by so many PR people over the years that you become a nihilist. So I was fortunate to avoid all of that, get hired at a high level. And the only reason that happened was because of desktop publishing and fiddling around at 2 a.m. with Quark Express and learning how to kern fonts and things like that, studying great magazines like Sports Illustrated. Why were they so readable? Why, What is the secret to writing great captions? What is the secret to pairing a headline and a subhead? Forbes in the old days was famous for that, a really short headline and then a explanatory subhead that made the whole package. Aha. Sports Illustrated, along with The Economist, is famous for the best caption writing in the world. And, to actually be able to get in there and create a photo box and a caption box and to experiment writing captions, to me, it was like, I suppose it'd be like a gun nut, being let loose at the DOD or something, to me, it was like just a running enthusiast being let loose in the warehouse at Nike. To me, it was just fantastic.
That's really interesting. I'm curious, Rich, did you have an entrepreneurial streak in you? Had you been seeking an idea that was kind of uniquely yours that you could explore? Was it just the right circumstances, in fact, the technology and your experiences coming together to present itself in that way? Were you at a point in your career where you felt like you could take a risk? How did that come together?
I wouldn't consider myself a primary entrepreneur. I certainly had learned how to be self-sufficient and self-employed. I mean, before we created the magazine, I was making my living as a technical writer at a think tank in Palo Alto, and then also using my Mac to learn how to create promotional material and things like that. But that's self-employed. That's not really being an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is somebody who mobilizes resources to pursue an opportunity to grow. I think there's a big difference. A lot of people call themselves entrepreneurs who are self-employed. There's no dishonor being self-employed, but the entrepreneur is always looking for ways to grow and expand the business. So I wouldn't consider myself a primary entrepreneur. I have great admiration for them, but I'm a great partner with a primary entrepreneur. What I need is a promoter and a salesperson and a person who's far more extroverted than I am. And when I am paired with somebody like that and we both have a vision, then it works out pretty well. My partner in creating Upside, a guy named Tony Perkins, after I joined Forbes, he created a magazine that did very well in the 90s called Red Herring. Earlier in the 80s, he and I created an organization called the Churchill Club, and I was kind of the intellectual end of that, and he was more of the promoter end of that. So I really think that totally underestimated is the ability of people who aren't primary entrepreneurs, but who work great with a primary entrepreneur, or teams of 3 or teams of 4. I think you get founding teams of more than 4, and you get too unwieldy. But I'm very interested in this topic of solo entrepreneurs, pairs, trios, and quads, because sometimes the magic really comes in being what the other person is not, but the thing that you do is superior to what they could do on their own.
Well, talk a little bit about, Rich, your own. What is it? What do you think sort of the secrets to your success have been? You talked a bit about what you bring to the table in terms of the intellectual weight and curiosity, and certainly a big work ethic. You obviously also are a great connector of people. You've got a great network. You think a little bit about who pairs well with whom and where value can be created among people who you know. I'm curious, any other sort of reflections in terms of the secrets to your own success?
Oh, well, I mean, how do you even talk about the role of serendipity? When Upside went through a difficult financial period, it was 1990, it was a recession, and that's why Forbes looked into buying us, and Steve Forbes decided to hire me instead. Well, I could have said no to Steve Forbes, and I could have disastrously said yes to an equally charismatic and accomplished figure named Bill Ziff, who took a liking to me. In fact, took me to a New York Knicks basketball game, flew me out first class. I'd never flown first class before from San Francisco Bay Area to New York, took me to a Knicks playoff game, met the team, all of that. And I would have been a disaster at Ziff, because I really wasn't that exclusively interested in PCs and things like that. I'm interested, I love technology, but I'm really interested in organizational health and the use of technology within organizations to build teams. I have kind of an athletic background. My dad was an athletic director, a very successful athletic director at the high school level. My brother we like to say, followed him into the family business. He's the athletic director at Rice University. And, I'm just profoundly interested in how you build great sports franchises, for example. And so the thing that really intrigues me about business is, how do entrepreneurs and teams create these winning organizations, particularly those that transcend different waves of technology, like the recently retired Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx, so successfully did and so successfully applied technology. So, to me, it's all about putting it all together and creating great, durable cultures that are resilient, that have moral foundation, so that employees won't hesitate pouring their best energies into the organization, that have great team construction, and then have great individual paths for development. Companies that are able to recruit, retain, and upskill people, and you put that together as a package. To me, that's really interesting. It's eternally interesting.
All very interesting. The other thing that certainly is so clear in this conversation, Rich, is the breadth of your knowledge and areas of interest. And I wonder, what are some of the ways in which you stay informed? What does your intellectual diet look like on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis?
Well, I always make sure that I have a really the latest, greatest big screen iPad that I put on a tripod on top of a couple of books, so it's at eye level. And that's replaced my morning newspaper reading, and it has for the last 10 years. I probably spend 2 hours just lazily lingering over breakfast. Recently I've been trending more toward a whole food, plant-based diet. So, I make my oatmeal and flaxseed and quinoa mush with raspberries and blackberries, and maybe a sprinkling of almond slices and some high protein plant milk, and then I just linger over. I like Real Clear Politics. I like Real Clear Markets. I go to Axios, Politico, The Hill. I go to Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Financial Times, The Economist. There are a lot of great, the information, I think, has emerged as one of the better. Jessica Lesson has done a really good job building that. So I think to me, it's like the go-to Silicon Valley kind of magazine. There are great newsletter writers like Ben Thompson. And, after about 2 hours, then I'm ready to go take a nap. No, I'm ready. I begin to feel a little bit informed about things, and then just begin to try to think of connecting the dots. Now, the other thing that's really going to be, this is like way out there in the tall outfield grass. Due to all the travel that I do for Forbes and do speaking events and moderating events. Now, for 2.5 years, there was not a lot of that. COVID is beginning to come back. And you well know, Peter, the life of a road warrior. What do you do when you're on a plane? I can't work. And I feel too guilty watching movies, unless maybe it's an international flight and I'll sneak in one. I read, but I read spy novels. I'm the biggest reader of spy novels that I know. Maybe Steve Forbes is he's a big fan of spy novels too. Spy novels is a genre. I feel like I'm a semi-expert in the genre. It's sort of like, we say that today is sort of the golden age of quality television, and it is. You compare television dramas to those of the 70s and 80s, and they're so much better technically produced, character nuance, plot complexities. We thought Mission Impossible, or at least people my age, you were a tot then, but, Mission Impossible was like cutting edge, when it came out in the late 60s or early 70s. And same thing has happened in spy and espionage novels. So if you read, Ian Fleming's James Bond series, which started in 1953, went to 1964 or something like that, 65, they were pretty cartoonish compared to what you get now. So I read those because I think you get a lot, you actually learn a lot about cybersecurity. You learn a lot about diplomacy, espionage. You learn a lot about competing factions and the role of the economy and the role of business in that. And then you learn a lot about plot and narrative. And I really think that one of the superpowers you can have in business is to speak well, and communicate well. I mean, those old classic skills still really will cause a person to stand out. You combine that with financial knowledge, and now you've got the trifecta. I think of things that beyond becoming an expert in your core category, will propel you to a higher level in your career. But knowing narratives, I think that you get, and knowing how to write in a way that people will not drop what they're reading. If you think about what a spy novelist does, nobody is forced to read a spy novel. They live and die on whether people keep turning the page. And so there's a lot to be learned about how to write in a way that keeps people turning the page. And only the fussiest of academics would say that you necessarily have to compromise what you're saying to resort to this cheap trickery of getting the reader to keep turning the pages, which is a total crock. You can write profoundly interesting, deep things, thoughtful things, and still have people turning the page. So that's, I don't know whether I'm just coming up with an excuse for the tens of thousands of dollars I've probably spent with Amazon over the years, and now my ninth Kindle. They do wear out, and I immensely enjoy that. I'll just give you one example of where I think narrative is just a very useful way to think about that. At the Forbes CIO Next conference that you and I are doing on October 27th in New York. Look it up if you're interested. It's a hybrid event. One of our sponsors is Tableau, which is now owned by Salesforce. And I'm talking to this fascinating woman named Wendy Batchelder. This is a recording that we're doing in the context of Tableau's sponsorship, so it's not on a regular agenda. And she's sort of exists. She's a senior vice president that really exists at the intersection of trust and data. Now, you think about what's the narrative there. It's a three-part story. One is the value of trust in business. Now, we've known, the value of trust in business for a long time. Stephen M.R. Covey wrote a book in 2006 called The Speed of Trust. You think about it in an organization or in an economy, when you don't have trust, then you get lawyers and HR, and everything becomes a complex negotiation. So you want to have trust. It's a really valuable thing, particularly in a fog of war economy that we're in today. Then what is the value of data in trust? There's a lot. You can bring people together who maybe don't speak the same language. They're from different parts of the world. They're even, sort of different backgrounds within a company. And data is a great lingua franca to unite people to agree on what the issue is, what the possible solutions are, and how we might go forward. But then you have the Act 3, and that's implementing it. Our mutual friend, Tom Davenport, the great analytics expert, talks a lot about how a lot of people resist data analytics because they feel that it reduces their power. A lot of this has to do with old style CEOs. I have the great gut. My gut instinct trumps all of your data. Well, let's see about that. Let's put it to a test. But you do have those pockets of resistance. So trust is great. Data-driven trust is even better. And then how do you implement it, and how do you get buy-in around it? And you see, that's a three-part story. And I think just simply, that's kind of the thing that I think, being a more experienced person in business at my, emeritus stage of my career at Forbes, that I'm able to see with greater clarity than I did earlier in my career, when maybe I was a Quark Express whiz.
Well, one of the things that, again, shines through in that response, as it has as a thread throughout this conversation, Rich, is the breadth of your areas of curiosity. Long before we met, when I was an admirer of your work, I admired the fact that you didn't have a single lane that you chose, or that you were confined to, but rather sought connections across a variety of different areas, from business to politics to, of course, different segments of the economy, how the world sort of fits together, in addition to thinking about the kind of, the ways in which culture and politics, here I mean in a company setting, can lead to either success or a lack thereof as well. What a an interesting journey you've been able to find by virtue of your great knowledge, your great ecosystem, but very importantly, your great storytelling and your ability, your great writing skills to not be confined to a certain place, but rather be somebody who can wander to those areas that you find most interesting.
Well, I think as a piece of career advice, and anytime you hear me talking about career advice, fact check it, and take it with a grain of salt and all the necessary things. But to manager or people who've been told that they need to stay in their lane, don't take it too literally. I think what your boss is saying, maybe inartfully, is that be the best swimmer in your lane that you can be. You've got a lane, be the master of that lane, whatever that expertise is required. And when you go outside your lane, be somebody who helps people swim their lanes better too. Don't be bossy. Don't be, the critic looking from lane 5 over into lane 6 saying, you need to improve the kick on your swim, or you're not putting your hand in the water right. Nobody likes that kind of person. So I think bosses will shorthand that, but I think it's an inartful thing to do. And if you're an up and comer in business, master your lane, and then figure out where you can be helpful in other lanes, starting with the lanes that are most adjacent to yours, where you've already built up your credibility for being good in your lane. And that's how I think you begin to build a sort of a broader set of tools that you can bring to your organization, or if necessary, that you can bring to your own entrepreneurial effort.
Well, it's great advice, and certainly advice that you have lived, and one can see that through your writing in periodical form, certainly at Forbes, your great books, including Late Bloomers, The Soft Edge, Life 2.0.
Well, Peter, it must be said, when I found myself swimming in the CIO lane around 2010 or 2012, or whenever we started our CIO conference, and it fell to me to get this thing running, I quickly discovered there was a much better lane domain master in this fellow named Peter High. So it was my great fortune that you were available to come aboard and start helping us and building this terrific franchise. And I think your whole CIO Plus practice is a testament both to your domain and lane knowledge, but also, the CIO Plus, as you pointed out, is somebody who could substitute for the CFO on a quarterly earnings call, or could substitute for the CEO in many situations. And in fact, at the Forbes CIO conference, we're going to be talking about CIOs. You're going to be leading a discussion of CIOs who've made it to the CEO level. So again, that's applauds to you, and a pitch that to anybody watching this, check us out. It's a virtual event. If we can see you in person, that'd be great. If we see you virtually, that'd be great too.
Yeah, well, that's really nicely said. And I thank you very much for your kind words. I consider it a great honor that our paths crossed, Rich. And I'm so pleased that circumstances have allowed me to become a collaborator of sorts with you as well. You really are so great at what you do, but also so kind and generous in the way you do it. So I really feel very honored to call you a friend.
Well, likewise, and we'll see you in New York.
I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully some of the people who are watching now will join us as well, just as you say. Rich Karlgaard, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a great conversation, as always.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And congratulations on all you've done in your consulting career and with Technovation and these great video series.
Well, thank you again.